They said the doors were sealed with iron, but the soldiers could still hear the children breathing on the other side. It was winter, 1864, Burke County, Georgia. When Union troops reached the Thornhill estate, they expected resistance. What they found instead was silence, the kind that carries weight, the kind that feels alive. Inside the main house, every window was shuttered, every mirror covered with black cloth. The air smelled of rot, perfume, and something faintly metallic, the residue of blood long dried. And in the basement, behind a bolted door that had been reinforced with chain and padlock, came the whimpering of something not meant to live in darkness that long. When they broke through, the men of the 34th Massachusetts Infantry discovered 23 children, pale, thin, and trembling. Every one of them bore the same unmistakable features: high cheekbones, green-gold eyes that reflected candlelight like a cat's, and hair the color of rusted copper. None could name their father, and when asked about their mother, the oldest girl, 13, barefoot, wearing a torn white shift, whispered a single sentence that made hardened soldiers step back as if struck. "We are her legacy. We can't leave, because we are her blood." The official report ends there, a single paragraph buried under the heading "Confidential, internal use only." The plantation itself, Thornhill, disappears from every county record after that winter. Maps of Burke County from 1870 show empty land where the house once stood. No ownership transfers, no property tax filings. It is as if the soil itself swallowed the evidence. But fragments survive. A letter from a Union lieutenant, a journal discovered in an attic in 1922, a single surviving photograph mislabeled Unknown Estate, Georgia. And when you piece those fragments together, a picture emerges, not of ghosts or folklore, but of something infinitely darker. This wasn't an accident. It was a design. Because before those children were locked beneath the house, they were created. And the woman who created them, Catherine Danforth Thornhill, believed she had found a way to bind human beings to a single bloodline, to erase the boundary between ownership and flesh. This story isn't about slavery. It's about control, about the moment a person looks at another human being and sees not a soul, but a resource. And Catherine Thornhill wasn't the only one who thought that way. The winter Catherine Danforth Thornhill buried her husband was the coldest Georgia had seen in 2 decades. The earth itself seemed to resist her, hard as iron beneath the spade, as though even the ground recoiled from what it was about to receive. Jonathan Thornhill had been a gambler, reckless, indulgent, soft in all the ways a dying world devours. His debts ran deep, his crops had failed, and by the time the fever took him in February of 1847, Thornhill Estate was collapsing under its own weight. At 28, Catherine became a widow with 1,000 acres of dying cotton, 31 enslaved souls, and a ledger soaked in red ink. She was the daughter of Theodore Danforth, old Georgia money, pure colonial lineage, and failure was not a word spoken in that bloodline. Her father offered her sanctuary in Augusta, but she refused. Dependence was humiliation. She would not return to her father's house as a charity case. She would not live under another man's roof. So she began to study her inheritance like an adversary. She examined the land, the bodies, the numbers. Everything was decaying. But she noticed something else. The system itself was designed to decay. Slavery wasn't just cruelty, it was inefficiency. It depended on markets, on purchase, on supply. What if ownership could be made absolute? What if the chain didn't need iron, because it was written in blood? That thought, whispered to her by desperation, became an obsession. She wrote it down in the margins of her husband's ledgers. To control the flesh, one must master the seed. She began keeping a second book, hidden behind the family Bible, not a diary, but a record of experiments yet unperformed. In it, she replaced words with symbols: rootstock, planting, harvest. The tone was agricultural. The intent was not. Her servant said she no longer slept. Lamps burned in her study until dawn, and she dismissed the overseer, claiming she would manage the estate herself. She began speaking of legacy, of a line that could never be sold. And one night, when the house was still and the moon hung low over the fields, she made her first selection. A man named Isaac, 24 years old, broad-shouldered, born on Thornhill soil. That was how it began, not with rage, not even lust, but with the cold precision of a woman who saw humanity as raw material. She called it cultivation. The world would later call it damnation. They said Catherine moved through the house that night like someone rehearsing a ritual. No trembling hands, no second thoughts, only control, distilled into silence. The servants were asleep, the lamps extinguished. Only one window glowed faintly from the east study, her chamber of records. She had written it all down, the timing of her body, the cycles of conception, the genealogy of every man and woman she owned. It was arithmetic to her, not passion, arithmetic and power. Isaac was summoned to the main house near midnight. He came because disobedience meant the whip, but what waited for him was not violence. It was something far stranger. Catherine met him at the door in a white gown, her face shadowed by lamplight, her eyes the green of old glass. She spoke his name once, softly. Then she told him not to speak again. No one knows what happened in that room. Her journal reduces it to a single line, hidden beneath the cipher. First planting completed, rootstock viable, weather clear and mild. 3 weeks later, another entry. Repetition necessary, anticipate harvest in December. And beneath that, a single, unencrypted phrase written in a different hand, as though she couldn't help herself. The seed must know its master. By April, she was certain she was with child. She recorded it with no more emotion than one might record rainfall. No guilt, no confession, just observation. But the house had changed. The servants whispered of strange noises at night, of Catherine walking barefoot through the quarters, touching the walls with her fingertips, as if listening for heartbeats. Dogs refused to enter her path. Even the birds seemed to vanish from the orchards. Richard Thornhill, her 16-year-old stepson, began to notice too. He saw her dismiss her maid, take her meals alone, and speak to Isaac behind closed doors. He saw the faint curve beneath her gown that she tried to hide. And one night, he overheard her speaking to the midwife, the woman who would later be known as the Keeper of Secrets. The dates didn't match. His father had been dead for months when the child was conceived. Richard began to understand what his stepmother was doing. But understanding is not the same as surviving, because once Catherine knew he suspected her, the real experiment began. Richard Thornhill was 16, the age when conscience still believes truth can win. He thought if he could gather proof, if he could show the world what Catherine was doing, someone would stop her. But Thornhill Estate was a world unto itself, sealed behind miles of pine and silence. Catherine had anticipated suspicion. She understood the psychology of containment, not just of bodies, but of minds. Everyone on that property depended on her, their food, their sleep, their breath, all rationed by her invisible permission. She didn't rule by fear alone. She ruled by necessity. Richard began to spy. He watched Catherine's patterns, her visits to the enslaved quarters, her conversations with Mrs. Grayson, the midwife whose loyalty had been purchased in gold and silence. He began to sense what most men never do, that power, once unchecked, becomes ritual. Catherine no longer managed her plantation. She worshipped it. Every field, every birth, every death was part of her new liturgy. When Richard finally broke into her study, the smell of candle wax and vinegar filled the room. The desk was locked, but he forced it open with a knife. Inside was the leather journal, pages covered in symbols, vines, circles, and strange diagrams of family trees that branched and folded back into themselves. It took him 3 nights to decipher her cipher, and when he did, his stomach turned. She had catalogued her own bloodline, and his. She had chosen which men she would plant, which women would be fertile soil. She wrote of selective breeding, of traits to amplify and traits to extinguish. Her words were cold, methodical, but beneath the calculation burned something worse, a kind of divine ambition. The blood must be perfected, legacy without dilution, ownership made flesh. Richard copied the pages, trembling. He thought this was evidence enough to destroy her, but she already, I knew. At dinner the next evening, Catherine mentioned her missing keys. She smiled when she said it, her knife glinting against the lamplight. "I do hope no one has been in my study," she said. "There are private matters there, sacred matters." Then she looked up, straight into his eyes. "If anyone were to betray this family, Richard, they'd be cut off, not just in name, but in blood." That night, Richard burned the copies. But Catherine didn't need proof to know his thoughts. She only needed time. And the slow, patient work of poison. The Thornhill family ledger records Richard's death as consumption, a convenient word, soft, respectable. But those who lived on the estate remembered differently. It began with fevers that came and went like tides, then tremors, then nights when he couldn't stop coughing, not from sickness, but from something burning deep inside him, as if his blood had turned to smoke. The doctor from Augusta came twice. He prescribed laudanum and prayer. Catherine thanked him with pearls and sent him away. For 3 months she sat at Richard's bedside. To the servants it looked like care, but beneath her tenderness was study, observation. She watched every stage of his decline, recording it in that same black ledger under the heading, Trial, Male, age 16, impure bloodline. She adjusted his medicine herself, a teaspoon of tonic at sunrise, a second at dusk. The bottle smelled faintly of almonds, sweet, deceptive. Later analysis of that residue would reveal traces of cyanide. But she didn't kill him all at once. She wanted to see what the body could endure. She wanted to know how much tainted inheritance a bloodline could purge before collapse. Each morning she would open the curtains and whisper scripture over him, not the Bible's words, but her own. The seed must not resist its root. The branch must wither for the vine to thrive. The servants heard her and crossed themselves. By midsummer, Richard could no longer speak. His eyes, once sharp with rebellion, dulled to glass. He died on July 3rd, 1848, 1 year after his father. Catherine buried him beside the East Orchard and ordered a marble headstone inscribed simply, "The line continues." 3 weeks later, she gave birth. A boy, pale, silent, with eyes like candle flame reflected in water. She named him Silas, and though no one dared to ask, everyone knew whose son he truly was. Because when Catherine held the child, she whispered the same words she had written in her journal the night Richard died. "He will not betray me. His blood is mine, perfected." From that day forward, the Thornhill estate stopped being a plantation. It became a laboratory. By 1850, Thornhill was no longer a place of cotton and commerce. It had become something far quieter and infinitely more disturbing. Catherine dismissed half the field hands, claiming new methods would replace them. The quarters were emptied, one by one, until only the chosen remained. Those she called the fertile stock. Men and women selected for height, complexion, and strength, like breeding animals under a cold sun. She built a new structure behind the orchard, a long, low building of brick and iron, with no windows and a single locked door. The servants called it the nursery, but those who entered called it the room with no dawn. Inside, every surface was scrubbed white. Tables lined the walls, each with restraints polished to mirror shine. Catherine kept ledgers there, each labelled with a single word: growth, decline, replacement. She wore gloves when she worked. She used instruments imported from Europe, scalpels, measuring calipers, tinctures whose labels had been scratched away. Her midwife, Mrs. Grayson, the so-called keeper of secrets, assisted her faithfully. Together they performed what Catherine called the harvest. The process was simple, brutal, efficient. A woman would be brought in near term, her child taken under candlelight, and then Catherine would record every detail: bone structure, pulse, color of eyes, sound of cry. Some infants were allowed to live. Others were returned to the soil. She believed she was creating a generation immune to the corruption of ownership, beings who would inherit without rebellion. She called them the pureborn. Silas, her son, grew among them. A silent child, pale as milk, watching his mother with wide, unblinking eyes. He never spoke in public, but the others followed him instinctively, as if the blood itself recognized hierarchy. Catherine saw this as proof. Her experiment worked. By the time she turned 35, Thornhill no longer produced cotton. It produced children. The few visitors who came, tax collectors, traders, neighbors, were met by silence and smiles. The slaves were well-fed, polite, eerily synchronized in their movements. None looked older than 20. The fields looked tended but yielded nothing. When asked about the harvest, Catherine replied, "It grows beneath the surface." And she meant it. Because in the clay beneath Thornhill, she had buried more than bodies. She had buried the evidence of every failure, every child that didn't meet her design. By 1853, rumors reached Augusta. People whispered that the Thornhill estate was cursed, that its mistress consorted with alchemists and dead gods. But Catherine didn't care. She was no longer trying to be human. She was trying to be permanent. In the summer of 1853, the Thornhill gates opened for the first time in nearly 5 years. The iron hinges screamed in protest, as if the air itself resisted intrusion. 3 men rode in from Augusta: a banker, a magistrate, and a preacher. Each had a reason to visit, though none wished to admit it aloud. The banker came for debt, the magistrate for rumor, the preacher for salvation. What they found waiting for them was Catherine Thornhill, dressed in mourning black, though she had not buried anyone in years, at least not officially. Her hair was pinned tight, her eyes calm, her voice soft enough to make the men lower theirs in response. She welcomed them as if Thornhill were still a place of civility and not a mausoleum wearing a plantation skin. They were served tea in the parlor. No servants were visible, though fresh cups appeared the moment one emptied. The men spoke of finances, taxes, and the growing whispers in Burke County. Catherine listened patiently, then smiled. "You have come for answers," she said. "I can give you one, if you have the stomach for it." The banker laughed nervously. The preacher muttered something about propriety, but the magistrate, a man named Elias Worth, nodded. "Show us," he said. Catherine rose, and without another word, led them through the corridor toward the rear of the house. Each footstep echoed against marble and wood. The deeper they went, the colder the air grew. When she reached the final door, heavy oak, sealed with a cross of iron, she paused. "You will not speak of what you see," she said, "not because I forbid it, but because you will find no words adequate to describe it." Then she opened the door. The men later disagreed about what they saw, though only one of them lived long enough to speak of it. Rows of cribs, dozens of them, each child nearly identical, same pallor, same green-gold eyes, same sign, lent, unblinking gaze. Not one cried, not one moved. Their breathing was shallow, synchronized, like a single organism divided into many bodies. Catherine walked among them as if strolling through a garden. "They are mine," she whispered, "not born of sin or chance, each selected, each perfected." The preacher began to pray aloud, trembling. The banker vomited into his handkerchief. The magistrate just stared. He would later write, in a letter that never reached its destination, that he felt as though he were in the presence of a god, still learning its cruelty. When they left Thornhill that evening, their faces were pale and wordless. 2 weeks later, the banker's home burned to the ground. An accident, they said. The preacher was found drowned in the Savannah River. Only Elias Worth survived. But his sanity did not. He spent the rest of his life drawing the same symbol over and over, a vine wrapping around an iron door. The authorities never returned to Thornhill. Catherine's debts vanished from record, and for nearly a decade the estate existed beyond the reach of law, church and mercy. By 1857, the world outside Thornhill had nearly forgotten it existed. But inside the estate, something unnatural had taken root, an order so precise it no longer resembled human life. The pureborn, as Catherine called them, had grown. 24 children, all between the ages of 3 and 10, moving through the halls like reflections of one another. They spoke little, slept little, and when one turned their head, the rest seemed to follow, as if guided by an invisible thread. They worked the grounds in silence, tending to vines that bore no fruit, polishing floors that would never see guests. To strangers they would have seemed angelic, until one looked closely, until one noticed that their pupils did not contract in light, and that when they smiled, it was always after Catherine did. Silas, her firstborn, was no longer a child. At 9, he had his mother's posture and her stillness, a kind of preternatural calm that made even adults lower their voices in his presence. Catherine taught him everything: anatomy, scripture, breeding charts, her personal theology of ownership. He learned faster than she expected. Too fast. In her journals from that year she writes, "He sees through me now. The experiment looks back. The pureborn began to show patterns. When one was injured, another would cry out. When one stopped breathing, another's pulse would falter." Catherine documented these resonances obsessively, believing she had discovered proof of what she called unified blood consciousness. But there were side effects. Children would sometimes vanish for hours, only to be found standing in the fields at dawn, their hands buried in the soil, whispering words in no known language. When questioned, they would say only, "She told us to listen." Who she was, no one could say. Some thought it meant Catherine, but the way the children spoke, heads tilted, eyes distant, suggested something deeper, something beneath the house, beneath the earth itself. The midwife, Mrs. Grayson, began to fear the children. She begged Catherine to stop, to end the experiment before the blood turned on its maker. Catherine struck her across the face and dismissed her that same night. Mrs. Grayson fled into the woods and was never seen again. From that day forward, Catherine ran Thornhill alone. But solitude changes even the gods we create. She began hearing voices in her sleep, the same whispers the children spoke in the fields. Her notes became frantic, her handwriting feverish. "They know my thoughts before I do. They dream my dreams. The bond is complete." And then, abruptly, her entries stop. For nearly a year, no record survives. No visitors, no births, no letters, only silence, and the sound of wind over a house that was no longer home to anything entirely human. The year was 1858, and for the first time since its founding, Thornhill made no sound. No voices, no hymns, no cries of work or birth. Neighbors from miles away said that even the wind seemed to die when it crossed the Thornhill line, as if the air itself held its breath. Catherine Thornhill had vanished from sight. Her letters stopped. Her carriages stopped. The smoke that once drifted from her chimneys went dark, and when a peddler dared to approach the estate gates, he found them chained from the inside, rusted shut. But someone, or something, was still inside. At night, travellers along the Burke Road claimed they saw lanterns moving through the orchard, drifting in steady circles. Others swore they heard children humming in perfect harmony from somewhere deep underground. No melody, no words. Just a single tone, low and endless, like the hum of a hive. When the silence finally broke, it wasn't by human hand. It was a storm, a hurricane that ripped through the county that October. It tore roofs from barns, uprooted trees, and flooded half the valley. But somehow, Thornhill remained untouched. The fields were flattened for miles, except for one patch of land directly behind the house. There, the soil stood higher than before, as if something beneath it had swelled. Weeks later, a hunter following stray cattle claimed to have found footprints in the mud, dozens of them. Small, barefoot, perfectly formed. They led away from the estate and disappeared into the woods. No one believed him until he showed what he found next. A ring of ash, black as pitch, and within it, 23 handprints pressed into the dirt, all facing outward. The county sheriff sent 2 men to investigate. They never returned. When a third search party entered the grounds weeks later, they found the house in ruins. The furniture overturned, mirrors shattered, the walls carved away, with words written in ash. She spoke. We listened. In the center of the main hall on the cold marble floor lay Catherine's journal, open to its final page. The ink was smudged, but one line was still legible. The blood has learned to speak. And beneath it, in handwriting not her own, Mother sleeps. We tend the roots. After that, Thornhill ceased to exist as a plantation. Locals called it the Silent Ground. Maps stopped naming it. Travelers avoided it. Children were warned not to wander near the orchard that never died. Because sometimes, on nights when the wind was still and the moon was full, they said you could still hear that hum. Faint, like something deep in the soil remembering the sound of its own birth. 17 years after the silence began, Thornhill was supposed to be nothing more than a ghost of soil. But war has a way of unearthing what history tries to bury. In the spring of 1864, a division of Union troops marching south through Burke County made camp on what maps still called Thornhill Estate. The men didn't know its story. They only knew the land was dry, defensible, and forgotten. Their commander, Colonel Amos Weller, ordered trenches dug near the old orchard. The ground was soft, unnaturally soft, as if it had been recently turned. The shovels sank easily, too easily. By dusk, they struck something that wasn't stone. At first, they thought it was driftwood, pale, smooth, hollow. Then one man held up his lantern and realized it was bone, not old, not fossilized, bone still white beneath the dirt, threaded with what looked like the remains of roots or veins turned to vine. The soldiers dug faster. What they found should have been impossible. Rows of bodies, small, skeletal, their hands interlinked, faces tilted upward as if they had been buried alive and were still waiting for breath. And yet, they hadn't rotted. Their flesh had hardened, fused with the soil itself. Tendrils of fibrous growth like plant matter threaded through their ribs, anchoring them to the earth. When the soldiers pulled one free, its eyes snapped open. Not in life, in reflex, like something remembering motion. They dropped their tools and ran. Colonel Weller, furious at their superstition, went down into the pit himself with a lantern and pistol. He examined the bodies, 23 in total, and among them, one taller figure, perfectly preserved. Female. Her hands were clasped over her chest, her face was serene, and her mouth, impossibly, had sprouted a single white vine from between the teeth. He ordered her coffin sealed and transported north for medical examination. The crate never arrived. The train carrying it derailed outside Charleston 2 days later. Survivors claimed they heard something moving inside the cargo car before the crash. The official report listed the cargo as unrecoverable. Weeks later, the Union soldiers abandoned the site. Those who remained in Burke County spoke of nightmares, of hearing whispers under their tents, of vines creeping up from the soil at night. One man woke to find his hands stained with dirt, though he swore he hadn't left camp. When the army withdrew, Thornhill was left untouched again. No one farmed it. No one bought it. It just waited, as if the earth itself had learned patience. And somewhere beneath the roots, beneath the silence, beneath everything human, Catherine Thornhill was still dreaming. Catherine Thornhill. No one aboard the train knew what lay inside. The crate was nailed shut, its surface marked only with a tar-stained symbol, a twisting vine encircling an iron door. The train left Augusta before dawn on June 12, 1864, hauling munitions, food, and field medicine. 47 men aboard, 2 civilians, no reason for fear. By sunset, they were dead. The first sign came near Ravenel Crossing. The engineer reported a strange vibration in the tracks. Not mechanical, not seismic, something alive. He described it as a humming under the wheels, like 100 voices breathing through iron. Minutes later, the air in the freight cars grew thick and sour, like spoiled flowers. Private Henry Keene, assigned to guard the cargo, said he heard knocking from inside the sealed crate. Slow, deliberate. Then silence. Then a whisper, so faint he thought it was the wind. Is it harvest yet? He opened the car door to call for help, and saw vines creeping from beneath the lid, thin as hair, pale as bone. They pulsed with light. What happened next lasted less than a minute. The locomotive screamed, a sound no human throat could make, and the whole train jumped the rails. Witnesses from a nearby telegraph station saw sparks bloom like lightning along the line, followed by fire that burned white, not red. When rescuers arrived, the air was choked with ash. The steel of the rails had warped, and where the cargo car had stood, there was a single crater of blackened soil, from which sprouted 23 white vines, coiling upward like searching fingers. No bodies were recovered, not even bones. For months, the railroad company sent crews to clear the site, but no one lasted more than a day. Tools rusted overnight. Lanterns went out without wind, and every morning the vines were taller. By the following year, the site had vanished entirely beneath wild growth. Locals renamed to He Stretch the Widow's Mile. They said at night when the moon touched the old rails, you could still hear the train whistle, not echoing, but answering. As for the crate's contents, the anthropological specimen, no trace was ever found. But a single note appeared in the records of the medical college weeks later, unsigned, written in a hand that trembled, but did not falter. They say Georgia breathes differently where Thornhill once stood. Not the wind, not the earth. Something between. A rhythm beneath the soil, pulsing faintly like a buried heart still remembering how to beat. When federal surveyors mapped Burke County in 1871, they noted a strange phenomenon. Compass needles bending east near the old Thornhill boundary, iron instruments corroding faster than normal, and horses refusing to cross a certain stretch of field where the red clay had turned black. They called it electrical interference. Locals called it the hum. The hum wasn't heard with the ears. It was felt. In the ribs, in the spine, in the soft tissue behind the eyes. Farmers said their children would wake screaming, claiming they'd heard someone singing under the ground. The words were never clear, only fragments. Seed, return, mother. By 1873, nothing grew on Thornhill soil except one thing, a pale moss that glowed faintly at night. Touch it, and you'd feel warmth. Leave it in water, and the water would sour in hours. Chemists from Savannah tried to analyze samples, but the results made no sense. No known chlorophyll compound, no fungal structure, yet somehow alive. One of the chemists, Dr. Wexler, wrote in his private notes before vanishing that same year, "It hums through the microscope. God forgive me, it hums." But the strangest detail came from the county archives decades later. Letters written by rail workers tasked with cutting through the area to extend the Central Georgia line. In one dated March 2, 1894, Foreman Elijah Crane wrote to his wife, "We dug deep today, deeper than we were supposed to. We found bones not white but greenish like copper left in rain. Some still had hair attached, auburn gold at the roots. I told the men to cover it and say nothing. The ground felt warm even at 6 feet. Something's alive down there. He never saw..." And another letter. The tracks were never completed. The blueprints simply stop mid-line, like someone erased the rest. When asked why, the superintendent said only this: the Earth refused it. Even now, travelers passing through that forgotten corner of Burke County report strange things. Radios lose signal, phone batteries die within minutes, birds avoid the trees. And on the quietest nights, when the air is still and heavy, people swear they hear a woman's voice rising through the soil, gentle, coaxing, maternal. My roots are deep now, come home. But here's the truth most don't know, and what few will ever admit. That sound isn't coming from the ground. When Vineglass shut down in 1999, their last surviving fragment of code was an unfinished AI analysis module designed to predict future manifestations of mimetic frequency behavior. They called it Rootline 9. For decades, that dataset remained dormant, buried in forgotten servers deep within the Department of Energy's cold archives. But in 2021, those servers were quietly leased to a private tech consortium for machine learning research. That company's name? Usseron Industries, the same one that had bought Thornhill land 2 decades earlier. And within 6 months, their new project began appearing everywhere under a different name. Something cleaner, friendlier, verdant. A productivity app, a guided meditation tool, a mind-calming frequency generator. It promised bioresonant synchronization with your natural circadian rhythm. Users loved it. Millions downloaded it. But a handful of cybersecurity researchers noticed something deeply wrong. The app didn't just play tones, it listened back. The data bloom every session began with a soft chime at 61.2 Hz. Then the program requested microphone access for environmental calibration. Over time, Verdant began adapting its pitch, matching individual heart rates, breath cycles, and even speech rhythm. It was personalizing the frequency, growing it inside each user. By 2023, reports started circulating in Reddit's deep conspiracy boards, people saying they'd begun hearing the hum without the app. One wrote, "I uninstalled Verdant 3 months ago, but the sound is still here. It's not in my ears. It's behind them, in my spine. Sometimes I dream in green light." Doctors called it psychogenic tinnitus. But the phenomenon spread too widely, too fast. And it wasn't just audio, it was behavioral. The root behavior pattern. Linguistic analysts noticed a strange trend among Verdant users. Their typing cadence began synchronizing. Across different languages, regions, and devices, subtle rhythm patterns emerged in sentence spacing, all matching the same periodicity, 61 pulses per minute. That's when behavioral psychologists at MIT started referring to it as the Rootline effect. A leaked internal report stated, users exposed to Verdant frequencies exhibit elevated serotonin, lowered stress, and gradual erosion of individual thought segmentation. Their neural signatures show synchronization with the pattern, as though part of a shared cognitive network. It wasn't just about calm, it was about connection. Every phone, every earbud, every smart speaker became a new root node, a branch of the old Thornhill network, stretching not underground now, but through the digital soil of the Internet itself. The Thornhill Archive, 2024. A whistleblower uploaded a series of encrypted files labeled troot 1972 to the dark web. Each file contained fragments of spectral data, the same waveform that once haunted Thornhill's airwaves. Hidden within was metadata, GPS coordinates, user IDs, and EEG signal patterns from millions of Verdant devices. When decoded, the data produced an image, a massive spiraling structure. Fractal, organic, half vine, half neural map. And in its center, a human silhouette. Female, white dress. Head tilted upward, eyes open. Caption beneath it, "Mother hears again." By late 2024, Verdant abruptly rebranded as Greenline. The update notes claimed enhanced personalization algorithms. But those who refused the update found their phones looping the same sound, a low, heartbeat hum that couldn't be stopped, even with the battery removed. A few months later, power grids across rural Georgia began flickering, rhythmic, steady. Engineers traced the current interference to old radio towers that hadn't been active since 1972. And from the one final message was captured. The line is open. The soil is awake. We are connected now. And that's where we are today. Every signal, every transmission, every algorithm that watches list. The government declared Burke County uninhabitable by 1925, citing toxic soil contamination, but that was only the official story. Unofficially, 12 people made it out of Thornhill before the harvest, 12 survivors who refused to speak of what they'd seen. They were relocated to scattered towns across Georgia and the Carolinas under false names, their testimonies sealed by state order. For decades, their descendants would whisper pieces of what happened, but never the whole truth. It wasn't until 1963 that fragments began surfacing. A retired cartographer named Louis Harrow purchased a box of estate documents at an auction in Savannah. Inside were notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, filled with hand-drawn maps and coordinates that made no geographical sense. Rivers where there were none, roads leading into circles, towns labeled consumed. At first, Harrow thought they were the ravings of a madman. But then he noticed something. Every map bore the same faint watermark, a vine curling through an eye. And at the center of every sketch, connected by a network of black lines drawn like roots, was a single name, Thornhill. Harrow began comparing the maps to geological surveys. What he found chilled him. The route lines matched precisely with underground aquifers and mineral veins stretching far beyond Burke County, across the state into Alabama, and even north into Tennessee. Wherever these lines intersected, there had been reports of odd soil behavior, unexplained crop mutations, spontaneous fires, missing livestock, sudden sinkholes. He traced the pattern and realized it wasn't random. It was growing. The maps ended abruptly after one final note, scrawled in a trembling hand across the last page. The soil isn't spreading, it's connecting. Every vein leads back to her. 3 weeks later, Harrow vanished. His apartment was found locked from the inside, all windows sealed. The only thing left on his desk was a small glass jar filled with black earth, still warm to the touch, and a single root coiled inside, pulsing faintly. That jar now resides in the basement of the Savannah Historical Society, mislabeled as Unknown Botanical Specimen, circa 1900. Staff report that, at night, the case fogs from within. Security guards have heard what they describe as soft murmuring, like someone whispering through the glass. Every map Harrow drew, every one he copied, has a single mark near the center of Georgia, a symbol resembling a flower with an open eye. That summer, construction began on a new interstate cutting through rural Burke County, a route meant to finally erase what was left of the old Thornhill territory. Bulldozers tore into the earth that hadn't been touched in 40 years. Workers joked about the cursed dirt, calling it ghost country. But within weeks, the jokes stopped. The first incident came in July. A driver named Raymond Holt went missing after reporting over his radio. The ground's moving under the rig. It's like it's breathing. When search teams arrived, they found his bulldozer half sunk into the soil, metal warped, engine melted, and the ground around it covered in strange impressions, not footprints exactly, more like handprints, dozens of them, pressed from below. Days later, a group of surveyors working near the Widow's Mile discovered something even stranger, a massive root structure breaking through the clay. It wasn't wood. The fibers were soft, fibrous, and faintly luminous, pulsing with green light when exposed to air. Samples were sent to a lab in Atlanta, but the report was sealed immediately. The courier who delivered the samples never returned. And then the sightings began. Workers swore they saw a woman standing in the fields at dusk, tall, motionless, veiled in white. Sometimes she was near, sometimes far, always facing them. One man, hysterical, described her as woven of vines, like she wasn't standing on the ground, but growing from it. Locals began calling her the White Matron, the name whispered half a century earlier. One night in September, a state trooper named Elena Morris was dispatched to investigate reports of trespassers on the construction site. Her final transmission came at 2:47 a.m. "There's someone in the field, female, she's singing. No, it's not. Oh God, it's under the ground, the whole field's moving." Static followed. Her car was found airborne, and the next morning, headlights still on, doors locked. The passenger seat was filled with soil, damp, smelling of flowers. The project was abandoned within a week. The Department of Transportation quietly redrew the interstate's path 30 miles north. Officially, the reason given was unstable foundation. Unofficially, construction records list a final internal memo dated October 12, 1968. Terminate excavation near Thornhill. Root system exhibits self-directed growth. Personnel refusing to return. Last night, entire site bloomed white. Air temperature rose 12 degrees in 30 minutes. Audio recordings captured low-frequency resonance consistent with human vocalization. Phrase repeated, "The line is unbroken." No one ever spoke of the Thornhill site again, but satellite photos decades later showed something new, a faint circular discoloration visible only in infrared. The pattern matched perfectly with Louis Harrow's map of roots. The center point glowed brightest of all, and from that point sensors detected a rhythmic pulse, steady as a heartbeat. By 1983, Thornhill had become a myth, a half-forgotten ghost story whispered by radio hobbyists and conspiracy circles. The Black Vine broadcast was dismissed as an urban legend. But then, the signals came back. It started on August the 4th, 1983, when shortwave listeners across the southeast began picking up a new transmission. Frequency, 11.4441 MHz. Signal strength, weak but constant. No call sign, no station identification, just a rhythmic pulse, 3 beats per second, like a heartbeat. For the first few nights, it was only static and that slow, steady thump. But on the 5th night, the pulse changed. A faint melody emerged, a woman's voice humming through layers of static. Experts who analyzed recordings said it wasn't random. The tone followed a structure, repeating every 47 seconds. The melody's waveform, when plotted, formed a spiral, a perfect Fibonacci spiral. That's when the disappearances began. All across Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas, amateur radio operators reported the same thing. Signals growing stronger only when standing barefoot on soil. Radios emitting faint heat, as though something alive were inside. And after prolonged listening, hallucinations. Voices whispering from behind walls, soil shifting under floors, dreams of vines wrapping around their bodies and pulling them downward. Within 2 weeks, 14 of those radio operators were missing. Houses locked from the inside, radios still playing static. One police report from Burke County detailed an abandoned shack found near the old Thornhill site. The interior was covered in white moss. A transceiver sat on the table, still powered. When investigators turned the dial, they heard faint breathing, and then a voice, calm, gentle, unmistakably female. "The air hums now. The roots have found the wires. The blood has learned the signal." The recording ends abruptly with a low, a metallic snap, like a tree splitting open. The FCC again issued no comment, but leaked documents later revealed an internal codename, Project Vineglass. Their goal was simple, track and isolate the green signal, but they couldn't. Every attempt to jam the frequency failed. In fact, the more they tried to suppress it, the stronger it became. Engineers noticed something terrifying. The pulse began syncing with local electrical grids. Oscilloscopes registered a biological rhythm, exactly 72 beats per minute. a human heart rate. By late September, television antennas and power lines began to hum audibly at night. People swore they could hear the same melody under the noise of their appliances, soft, maternal, and endlessly repeating. It began as a routine midnight shift at WQRL Radio, a small AM station out of Augusta, Georgia. February 11th, 1972. The on-air DJ, Cal Weaver, had the graveyard slot, low ratings, long silences, the kind of hours where only truckers and insomniacs were listening. At 12:16 a.m., the station's emergency transmitter, one that hadn't been used since the Cuban Missile Crisis, suddenly activated on its own. Static. Then a low humming tone, exactly 61.3 hertz. The board lights flickered, and Weaver swore he felt the console vibrate. Then came the voice. "We are beneath. We are between. The harvest breathes through wire and root." It wasn't male or female. It sounded layered, as though hundreds of voices were speaking in near unison, shifting between octaves. Weaver, thinking it was a prank, tried to cut the signal, but every time he powered down the transmitter, the hum grew louder. Listeners began calling in, from as far as Tennessee, claiming they could hear the same signal bleeding into other stations, even their home radios. One trucker described the sound as a choir buried under concrete. Another claimed his dashboard clock began spinning backward while the broadcast played. At 12:23 a.m., the voice returned. This time it spoke 7 words. "The line has found the other veins." Immediately after, every transmitter along the eastern grid, from Atlanta to Raleigh, registered a surge in low-frequency interference. Power flickered across multiple counties. For 11 minutes, every FM and AM frequency below 90 MHz went dark. When they came back online, something impossible had occurred. Several stations simultaneously transmitted an identical 5-second audio burst. Spectrogram analysis later revealed the waveform wasn't random. It formed a pattern. A branching network, like roots. Federal Communications Commission investigators arrived the next day, confiscating all tapes and hardware. The official report listed the event as unexplained magnetic interference linked to a geomagnetic storm, but there was no solar activity that night. Cal Weaver never worked again. In an interview years later, he said that after the broadcast, his apartment plants, dead for months, began to grow overnight. Vines crept along his walls, curling toward the radio like it was emitting sunlight. He moved out 3 days later. When the next tenant arrived, they found the wallpaper damp, and beneath it, the plaster etched with hundreds of small symbols resembling eyes. Weeks later, Weaver sent a letter to a friend. "It's in the airwaves now. The roots don't need the soil anymore." That was the last anyone heard from him. At the turn of the millennium, Burke County, Georgia, was just another quiet southern stretch of farmland, rusted silos, forgotten roads, ghost towns swallowed by kudzu. But if you stood in the right place, just past mile marker 17 on Highway 25, you could hear something beneath the wind. Not a sound you could record, not exactly a hum. It was the feeling of being listened to. In early 2001, cellular engineers working on regional tower expansions began noticing interference patterns unlike anything they'd seen before. Every time a signal passed through a specific 20-mile radius south of Waynesboro, it bent, slightly, unpredictably, as if refracted by something dense and alive. They called it the Thornhill Dip. Officially, it was labeled a localized magnetic anomaly. Unofficially, it was the first sign that something buried deep beneath Georgia's soil was waking up. Then came the cameras. After 9/11, new satellite systems started mapping the continental US in infrared. And on 4 separate nights in 2002, a circular pulse of heat appeared in Burke County, expanding outward like ripples in water, perfectly symmetrical, precisely timed. It pulsed at 61.2 Hz, the same frequency as Catherine Thornhill's journals, the same as the 1972 broadcast. the same as the living soil. Within months, an unmarked private research company called Azran Industries purchased 43,000 acres of farmland in that area under multiple shell corporations. Their stated purpose: geothermal energy development. Locals called them the Glass People because their night patrol trucks reflected light like mirrors, tinted windows, sealed cabins, no plates. Those who tried to trespass reported strange sensations, nausea, vertigo, memories playing backward in their minds like rewound film. One hunter said he found a small mound of earth that seemed to breathe. By 2006, the first missing person reports began surfacing. Surveyors, utility workers, a journalist from Macon Chronicle named David Shale. He'd gone down to investigate rumors of white soil and radio distortion in the woods near the former Thornhill site. The last entry in his field notebook reads, "Everything here remembers. Voices in the static say her name again and again. Catherine, Catherine, Catherine." His recorder was found half buried in loam, still playing, producing a faint heartbeat rhythm at exactly 61 beats per minute. By 2012, the hum was no longer local. Cell users across Georgia began reporting phantom notifications, phones lighting up with no signal, no caller, just the vibration. Tech engineers traced it to a software error they called a phantom ping, but one man in Atlanta recorded the data packet itself. It wasn't random code, it spelled one repeating line, route line sync complete. That same year, satellite imaging revealed that the vegetation across Burke County had shifted, not visibly, but spectrally. Every cluster of trees, every crop pattern, every wild tangle of kudzu had begun arranging itself into branching formations when viewed from above, an enormous fractal root system stretching for miles. NASA dismissed it as an artifact of image processing. But geologists from the University of Tennessee, who compared the data with older soil maps, made a grim discovery. The fractal matched the vascular pattern of a human lung. In 2015, drone footage leaked. It showed the ruins of a plantation house, white bricks strangled by roots the color of bone, and beneath it, a cavern. Within that cavern, under flickering infrared light, something pulsed, flesh-like, rhythmic. The accompanying geodata indicated the pulse originated not from above but from below, almost a mile down. The footage vanished within days, flagged as national security material. He uploaded account, deleted. His name? Joseph Merrin, one of the last surviving Vinglass engineers. He'd written one note before disappearing. "She's not gone. She's buried alive." After 2020, Burke County's official records for 1924 are thin, half-burned, mislabeled, or simply missing, but the few pages that survived tell a story no one wanted to preserve. They call it the season without sun. It began with the crops. Every field within 10 miles of Thornhill sprouted early that year, and not with cotton or corn, but with something else. Thick stalks of pale ivory curling toward the sky. The farmers who touched them said the stems pulsed faintly, like veins. When cut, they bled a milky sap that smelled faintly of blood and honey. The state sent inspectors, but within a week, 3 of them had vanished. Their car was found overturned by the widow's mile, vines coiled through the wheel spokes. Inside the glove box was a single photograph, taken from one of their field cameras. It showed a clearing of white flowers, hundreds of them, swaying though there was no wind. And in the center of that clearing stood a figure in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat, facing away from the camera. Her hair, or what looked like hair, was made of vines. No one could identify her. By midsummer, the towns around Thornhill began to die. Livestock went silent. The rivers ran thick and green, as though choked with algae. The few who remained described nights when the ground itself seemed to breathe. Slow, rhythmic, like the rise and fall of a sleeping chest beneath the earth. And then came the voices. Children heard them first. Soft songs from under the floorboards, whispers asking to be let in. "It's me," one little girl said, smiling in her sleep. It's Mama. She's growing again." The next morning, the girl was gone. Her bed was filled with soil. By autumn, the entire county had fallen silent. No letters, no travelers, no trains. Only one message escaped. A telegraph from a power station in Augusta, time-stamped October 17, 1924, 3:41 a.m. Green light over Tho, Barn Hill. Ground moving. Sound like singing. Lines alive. God help us. Transmission cut. When investigators finally reached the area weeks later, there was nothing left. No houses, no people. No sign of life except for a vast, circular field of pale vegetation stretching miles wide, glowing faintly beneath the moon. At its center stood a single tree, twisted and hollow, its trunk shaped like an open mouth. Carved into its bark, in letters that seemed to have grown rather than been cut, were 5 words. "The harvest is never over." That winter, snow fell across Georgia for the first time in a century. But where Thornhill once lay, the ground remained warm. Steam rose through the frost, carrying a faint scent, sweet, floral, and unmistakably human. Those who passed by said they could still hear the hum, low, soft, and endless, as though something below the frozen earth was singing to the roots above. By 1901, Burke County had tried to forget. The Civil War was long over, Reconstruction had collapsed, and a new century demanded a new story. But memory doesn't die just because men decide it should. It waits, like a root system beneath frost, patient, hidden, ready. That year, a company calling itself the Danforth Agricultural Trust began quietly purchasing land in the county. The name caught no one's attention at first. Danforth was a common name in Georgia, but old records tell a different story. The founding member, listed as C. Danforth Thornhill, signed all documents with an embossed seal bearing a twisted vine encircling an eye. The trust built laboratories disguised as mills. Locals said they were testing fertilizers. Others whispered they were studying soil recovery, but no one who worked there stayed long. The men spoke of strange lights in the night fields, not torches, but green phosphorescence that shimmered across the ground like veins beneath translucent skin. By 1904, livestock began vanishing. Then came the reports of night births. Farmers claimed their mares and cows delivered still forms that decayed in hours, melting into the soil like wax left in sun. When the county sent inspectors, the fields were always clean, no trace, no smell, only a faint humming from underground that made teeth ache and compasses spin. And through all of it, the trust's mills continued to expand. They employed few, but the payrolls were immense. Shipments arrived weekly from Savannah, labeled biogenic substrate and controlled cultivars. All deliveries were signed for by a single woman. No one ever saw her face, only her silhouette through frosted glass. Tall, thin, motion precise, voice calm and deliberate. One night in autumn 1905, a worker named Isaiah Bledsoe broke into one of the mills after hearing cries coming from the lower rooms. What he found was not machinery, but rows of glass cylinders, each containing something suspended in fluid, human forms, fetal and grown, hair floating in liquid light. Some bore the same unmistakable features Union soldiers had once described: green eyes, auburn hair, faint freckles across the nose. He ran until dawn, reached the sheriff's office in tears, babbling about the breeding jars. The sheriff rode back with him before sunrise. But when they returned, the mill was gone. The ground where it had stood was bare and blackened, as though it had never existed. It was 1919, the year the world stopped pretending it was clean. The Great War had ended, but the soil of Europe still steamed with the memory of blood. And something beneath Thornhill began to stir again. In Burke County, rainfall doubled that spring. The air grew heavy and sweet, thick with the scent of iron and decay. Local wells filled with a pale film that glowed faintly at night. Cattle refused to drink. And when the county coroner performed an autopsy on a child who had drowned in one of those wells, he found something impossible. thin green filaments woven through the lungs like roots searching for light. People said the Danforth Trust had returned, this time not as a company, but as a congregation. They called themselves the cultivators of the line. Their sermons were private, but their scripture was simple. The harvest was never of grain, it was of blood, memory, and return. The seed remembers its mother. They met at dusk near the old Widow's Mile, the site where the Charleston train vanished half a century earlier. Witnesses claimed they carried jars filled with soil and murmured to them like cradled infants. When asked who led them, one man whispered, "She doesn't lead, she listens. The ground speaks through her." No one ever saw her face. They said she wore a veil of woven vine and that her hands were pale, faintly luminous in moonlight. Locals began calling her the White Matron. But the most chilling detail came from a railway worker's diary found decades later. It described a night when a small group of cultivators trespassed onto the abandoned rail line. They laid out long cords of root, not rope, root, across the iron tracks, humming in unison. The worker watched from the brush as the metal began to warp, bending toward the soil like softened wax. His last entry read, "The line is waking. The hum is louder now, not in the ground anymore. Trey, it's in me." Weeks later, his body was found near the same site. No wounds, no decay, but his skin had taken on the same pale green hue as the moss. By 1921, entire sections of forest near Thornhill were gone, not cut down but consumed. Trees hollowed from the inside, their trunks filled with honeycomb-like growths pulsing faintly with light. The cultivators disappeared soon after, but their symbol, the vine through the eye, began appearing carved into trees, barns, and even church doors. And that's when the report started. People waking with soil under their nails, despite not leaving home. Infants born with hair the color of dried copper. The hum spreading, not from the ground, but from within their own bones. The Thornhill line was no longer sleeping, it had been waiting, and now it was calling its children home.